Hello, all. My name is Michael Billy. I'm a mixed media artist from New Mexico, and today I'm going to be doing a technique on working with resin and encaustic. The resin I'm going to be using is art resin, and it's a 1-to-1, one part resin and one part hardener that you mix together to get your mix, and then you can add pigment to it to get any color you want. The first thing I'm going to do is lay down a piece of panel, and I'm going to cover it with plastic so that when I do my resin pour, it doesn't leave a mess, and resin won't stick to plastic, so it's an easy cleanup. And I have a silicone mold that I'm going to use, and I'm going to pour my resin into that, and that's going to sit for 24 hours while it cures, and then I can be able to take it out. And resin won't stick to silicone, so that's your best bet to, if you're going to do a casting, do it in a mold like this. And I use a cup that has measurings on the side in ounces and milliliters, but I usually use the ounces. I do 4 ounces of one hardener and 4 ounces of the resin, and mix them in equal parts. And then I take a silicone stick and I mix it with it, and make sure you get all the sides and the bottom and completely mix. And you mix that for 3 minutes to make sure that it's all mixed well, very, very well together. And then I add a little bit of India ink into it to get my little tints. Not too much that you can, it's still a little bit translucent, and that should be my color, my turquoise color for my resin part of the piece. Once the resin and the ink is completely and thoroughly mixed, I pour it into a silicone mold, and that's gonna sit and cure for 24 hours before I pop it out of the mold and use it in my piece. The bubbles in the resin are going to continue to come to the surface of the pour, and so I usually wait half an hour before I take a heat gun and I lightly braise it with the top of it to burst all the bubbles that have come to the surface. And I usually do that again half an hour later, because they're not all going to come to the surface at once. So and then I do it a second time. I braise it lightly with the heat gun. You can use a blowtorch, but that's going to damage the silicone mold, so I just prefer using the heat gun to slightly burst all the bubbles that come to the surface. Once the resin has cured enough that I can take it out of the mold, I take it out, and it's still a little flexible, and I can reshape it and sculpt it a little bit to get some more of a 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional relief out of it, instead of just having it laying flat. And so I take some rocks that I have and I just put them on there so that they retain its shape when I kind of give it some relief a little bit, and then I let that sit for another 24 hours while it's starting to really harden, and then that will retain its shape when I set it inside the wax cake that I'm going to be making. The rocks position with the resin folded and like that will keep it from flattening out, and it's going to sit there for another 24 hours while it cures even longer, and so that once I take all the rocks off, it'll retain its shape. The next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking this wax paper, and I'm going to be covering this whole cradle panel so that when I do my encaustic pour, the wax is not touching the wood, and so that once it hardens, I can take it off and reposition it back onto another panel that's bigger, that because this is going to be a wax pour and the resin is going to be sitting inside of it so that it all becomes one piece. And once I tape that wax paper to the cradle panel, I reinforce it a little bit with some more aluminum tape all the way around it to really secure it and make sure it's completely in position, and then make sure it's not going anywhere. And then once that is completely down, I add some blue tape all the way around the border of the panel to create a nice dam and make sure that it's all burnished on all sides so that there's no leakage when I do my encaustic pour inside the panel. Once the dam has been made, I melt my encaustic and now it's ready to be poured into the dam, and then I slowly, gently pour it all the way around so it's completely covered and it's deep enough that all the wax paper below it is completely submerged in encaustic. And then I'm going to lay my resin piece on top of that while it's still in its molten state, so that it will all harden and then it'll be nice, look like the resin is coming out of the encaustic. And when you set down the resin into the encaustic, do it very gently so not to cause too much of a ripple. And then that will let that sit, and then it'll harden. And once that completely hardens, and then you can take the tape off. Once the encaustic has completely cooled down and hardened, slowly pry it off the panel, and because just be very gentle with it because you don't want it breaking and or either chipping or anything, and then it takes the wax paper will come off very easily off the back, and then there you have your encaustic sitting with the resin piece inside of it, and that's going to become another piece of the whole composition that's being put together. And for the final step, you're going to be pouring that wax cake into with the inset of the resin piece onto that panel, and that's going to be your final resin pour. And I usually use black Gorilla Tape to make my dam with that because I find it to be the strongest of all the tapes I've used, and it really holds the resin in place and produces the least amount of leakage. I could use the aluminum tape, which a lot of resin artists use when they make a dam, but I find that the aluminum tape is hard to take off the resin once it cures, and the Gorilla Tape is easier to take off. And when I put down my Gorilla Tape, I usually reinforce it around the edges because that's where you're going to get the most possibility of leakage. So that I take another piece of Gorilla Tape and I put it on top of it and then just burnish the whole thing down, and to really secure it to keep from any of the resin from getting underneath the panel and pouring out and causing a dam break. You don't want that. And once the dam is all taped down, and then I take a pair of scissors and I burnish it all the way around each side to really make sure that the wood and the tape are completely sealed so that no leakage. You don't want any leakage. And once that is ready to go, you set it down in a nice level surface so that make sure everything in its right position so that you don't have to move it around once you do the pour. And then you take your mix and you pour the final coat of resin into it, and then that's going to sit for another 24 hours while it cures. And once the resin is completely poured over the wax and the resin piece in the middle, and then you just lightly use a heat gun to it to get the bubbles out, and then cover it up with the dust cover so that when it's curing, there's no debris. And then once that's done, you for 24 hours, you take the cover off, and then you peel off the Gorilla Tape, and there's going to be a little bit of residue from the tape that adheres to the side of the pour that you, so you can just dab it gently and it comes right off.